What would you do if you saw a young girl being denied boarding at an airport, only to later realize she was royalty? This is exactly what happened when Princess Charlotte arrived at Gatwick Airport, setting off a chain of events that left the staff regretting everything. Stay tuned, because this story will change the way you see the world of royalty and everyday life. A crisp winter morning set the stage at Gatwick Airport, where travelers hurried through security, some glued to their phones, others rushing to their gates. Among them, a small figure stepped out of a sleek black SUV. Princess Charlotte, just 9 years old, carrying herself with quiet confidence. Unlike the grand public appearances she was accustomed to, this time, there was no royal entourage, no flashing cameras, no fanfare. Dressed in a navy blue jacket and white sneakers, she looked like any other child. Her destination? A charity event in Edinburgh, a trip she had been looking forward to for weeks. Approaching the check-in counter, Charlotte clutched her boarding pass. A young employee, Sarah, was finishing up with another passenger when she looked up and called, "Next, please." Charlotte stepped forward, offering a polite smile as she slid her ticket across the counter. Sarah barely glanced at the name before her eyes caught the embossed royal crest. Something felt off. A child flying alone? In business class? Without immediate identification? "Is this your ticket?" Sarah asked, her tone neutral but skeptical. Charlotte nodded. "Yes, I don't have my ID with me, but that's my ticket. I'm Princess Charlotte of Wales." A long pause followed. Sarah, unsure, turned to a colleague, Frank, whispering about the unusual situation. Frank, an older staff member, studied Charlotte for a moment before shaking his head. "I'm sorry," Sarah finally said, this time more firmly. "We need to confirm this before allowing you to board." Charlotte's heart sank. She had experienced moments like this before. People doubting her identity, but this time felt different. She wasn't surrounded by her family or palace staff. She was just a little girl at an airport, facing uncertainty alone. The minutes stretched as the staff debated the validity of her ticket. Finally, Sarah gestured toward another security officer. "Please follow me," he instructed, leading Charlotte to a small, sterile side room. Inside, the stark white walls and buzzing fluorescent lights made the space feel cold. The realization settled in. She wasn't just being questioned. She was being held for verification. Another supervisor, George, entered, his eyes shifting between Charlotte and her boarding pass. "We're waiting for confirmation on your ticket," he explained, his tone clipped. Charlotte sighed, trying to stay composed. "My parents are expecting me in Edinburgh," she said softly. But the room remained silent, except for the occasional typing on a keyboard. Then, the door opened again, but this time, it wasn't another staff member. A tall, regal figure entered. The atmosphere shifted immediately. King Charles III, her grandfather, had arrived, completely unaware of the commotion surrounding Charlotte. Until now. The staff froze. The realization hit them like a wave. They had been questioning a royal family member, and now the king himself was standing in front of them. His gaze moved from Charlotte to the employees. "What seems to be the issue here?" His voice was calm yet commanding, the authority undeniable. Sarah swallowed hard. "Your Majesty, there was a mix-up," she stammered. "We were verifying the ticket." King Charles raised an eyebrow. "A mix-up?" He turned to Charlotte, who stood a little taller now. "This is my granddaughter, Princess Charlotte. I would suggest she be treated with the respect she deserves." Flustered, the staff rushed to verify the ticket. Within moments, Charlotte's boarding pass was handed back, along with a series of hurried apologies. "We deeply regret the misunderstanding," Frank said, bowing his head slightly. Charlotte nodded, accepting the apology, but the weight of the situation still hung in the air. King Charles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right, my dear?" "I am now, Grandpa," she whispered. As they walked toward the gate, the staff still looked shaken by their mistake. Charlotte couldn't help but wonder how they would recall this incident later. Would they be embarrassed? Would they laugh about it? She turned to her grandfather. I don't think they recognize me. King Charles smiled knowingly. People often don't recognize those who aren't constantly in the spotlight, he said. But remember, just because they don't see who you are right away doesn't mean you're not important. His words stayed with Charlotte as they passed through security, this time without any hesitation from the staff. Despite the royal status of her grandfather, she realized something valuable. It wasn't about the title. It was about the way you carry yourself. And as the plane took off, she leaned back in her seat, knowing that this experience was one she would never forget. As the clouds drifted past the window, Charlotte's mind replayed the events of the morning. What had started as a simple trip turned into a lesson on identity, respect, and perception. She wondered how different things might have been if she had arrived with her parents, surrounded by security. Would the staff have questioned her then, or would they have bowed instantly? King Charles, seated beside her, seemed to sense her thoughts. You see, my dear, he said, sipping his tea, sometimes being unnoticed is a gift. It allows you to see the world as it truly is, without the filter of titles or expectations. Charlotte nodded, understanding now. While she had been frustrated in that moment, she also realized the power of blending in. It had given her a glimpse into a world beyond royalty, one where she could learn, grow, and experience life in a way few others in her position ever could. As the plane cruised through the sky, Charlotte glanced at her grandfather, a thought lingering in her mind. Grandpa, do you think they'll remember this? She asked, her voice curious rather than resentful. King Charles chuckled softly, setting down his cup of tea. Oh, I'm quite sure they will, he replied. Moments like these teach people lessons they won't easily forget. Charlotte smiled, feeling a sense of peace. She had stepped into a situation where her title didn't define her, and while it had been uncomfortable, it had also been enlightening. Perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, this was just another step in learning what it truly meant to be royal, not just by name, but by character. As the plane continued its steady ascent, Charlotte rested her head against the cool window, watching the endless sky stretch before her. The morning's events replayed in her mind. The skepticism, the questioning, the moment of helplessness she had felt when she was taken aside. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted her identity, and deep down, she knew it wouldn't be the last. She sighed and turned to her grandfather, who was calmly sipping his tea, his posture relaxed yet regal. Do you think I'll always have to prove who I am? She asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. King Charles placed his cup down and studied her thoughtfully for a moment before responding. Perhaps, he admitted, but true recognition doesn't come from a name or a title. It comes from how you carry yourself, from the way you treat others. The people who matter will always see you for who you truly are. Charlotte considered his words, letting them sink in. For so long, she had believed that being a princess meant people would immediately know and respect her. But today had shown her something different. Outside the walls of the palace, she was just another person navigating the world. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. She glanced around the cabin, watching passengers lost in their own thoughts, reading books, typing on laptops, chatting with loved ones. They had no idea who she was, and for the first time, she realized there was a kind of freedom in that. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she turned back to her grandfather. I think I understand now, she said. Being unnoticed isn't a bad thing. It means I get to show people who I really am, not just who they expect me to be. King Charles nodded approvingly. That's the spirit, my dear. You have the power to shape your own identity, and that's something far greater than any title. Charlotte leaned back into her seat, a newfound sense of confidence settling in her chest. This experience, though frustrating at first, had given her something far more valuable than recognition. It had given her perspective. She watched as the clouds drifted by, feeling lighter than she had that morning. Maybe the world didn't always recognize her, but that didn't define her worth. What truly mattered was how she chose to carry herself, and the impact she made on the lives of others. And with that thought, She closed her eyes, letting the hum of the plane lull her into a peaceful rest, ready for whatever lay ahead. As the flight continued, Charlotte stirred slightly, opening her eyes as the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. She turned to see her grandfather flipping through a newspaper, his expression calm and composed. She hesitated before speaking. "Grandpa, do you ever get tired of being recognized everywhere you go?" King Charles chuckled, folding the paper neatly and setting it aside. "Ah, that's an interesting question," he mused. "There are days when it's exhausting, yes. But being recognized is not what truly matters. What matters is being remembered for the right reasons." Charlotte tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" He leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "People may know my name, they may bow or address me formally, but that's not what leaves an impact. It's the kindness we show, the wisdom we share, and the moments where we make a difference. That is what people remember long after titles and status fade." She absorbed his words carefully. The morning's frustration was now a lesson. She had worried so much about being acknowledged, but what if the real power lay in what she did rather than how she was seen? A thought crossed her mind, and she smiled. "So, if I treat people with kindness and respect, even when they don't recognize me, that's what really matters." King Charles nodded approvingly. "Exactly, my dear. A true leader, a true royal, doesn't need recognition to have influence. They let their actions speak for them." Charlotte exhaled, feeling a sense of clarity she hadn't had before. Maybe not being instantly recognized had been a blessing in disguise. She could move through the world not as a princess, but as a person, learning, growing, and leaving an impact in her own way. With that comforting realization, she looked back at the clouds outside her window, watching them drift across the endless blue sky. This was only the beginning of her journey, and now she felt more ready than ever to walk it. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice echoed through the cabin, announcing their approach to Edinburgh. Charlotte straightened in her seat, feeling the familiar excitement return. The morning's events had weighed on her, but now she felt lighter, more certain of herself and the lessons she had learned. King Charles glanced at her, noticing the quiet confidence in her eyes. "Ready for your event?" he asked with a knowing smile. Charlotte nodded. More than ever. As they stepped off the plane, the crisp Edinburgh air greeted them. A small group of officials and event organizers waited nearby, but Charlotte noticed something different. No one rushed to acknowledge her immediately, and for the first time, she didn't mind. She walked forward, shaking hands, greeting people with warmth, and listening intently to their stories. The children she had come to meet weren't concerned with her title. They cared about her presence, her kindness, and the attention she gave them. By the time the event was over, Charlotte felt something new inside her, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be royal. Not the titles, the status, or the recognition, but the ability to make a difference, to inspire, and to be remembered for more than just a name. As she and King Charles made their way back to the car, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You see, my dear, the world may not always recognize you at first, but the impact you leave will always be felt." Charlotte smiled, looking up at him. "And that's what really matters, isn't it?" He nodded, pleased. Indeed. With one last glance at the people waving goodbye, Charlotte stepped into the car, knowing that today had changed her forever. It wasn't about proving who she was. It was about showing the world through her actions. And that, she realized, was the true mark of a princess.